There is a wall in southern Egypt that almost no tourist is allowed to touch. It sits deep inside a tomb cut into a cliff in the Valley of the Kings, in a chamber that stays dark even at noon. The painting on it is faded now, ochre and black on cracked plaster. It shows a long, thin river running in a straight line, and a boat on that river, and beside the boat, hour after hour, the same figures repeating into the distance. Most people walk right past it. To the eye, it looks like funeral decoration, a prayer for a dead king, a picture of a soul drifting toward paradise. But hidden inside it is something that shouldn't exist, because this river does not flow across the surface of Egypt. It flows underneath it. The text painted around it says so plainly. It describes a waterway that runs beneath the ground, in darkness, carrying a traveler from west to east, through caverns, past lakes, through sand that has swallowed everything. And for over 3,000 years, scholars read that as poetry about the afterlife. In 2024, satellites found a buried river under the Egyptian desert, 64 kilometers long, running exactly where the texts said the hidden water should be. Not a myth, not a metaphor, a river, a real one, under the sand, mapped by radar, confirmed by drilling, sitting 25 meters below the feet of every farmer who has plowed that land for the last 40 centuries. This is the story of the Egyptian texts that describe what's below the Nile, and what we found when we finally went looking. The wall belongs to the tomb, catalogued as KV34. It was cut for Thutmose III, a pharaoh who died around 1425 BC, and it holds the earliest complete copy of a document the Egyptians called the Book of the Hidden Chamber. We know it today by a shorter name, the Amduat. The word means, almost literally, that which is in the underworld. It is not a story. It is structured like a manual. 12 sections, one for each hour of the night, each with a heading, a diagram, and a set of notes describing what is there, how it is arranged, and how to pass through it. The Egyptians did not write this on papyrus for the public. They sealed it inside royal tombs, on the walls of the burial chamber, where it would never be read by the living. It was knowledge meant to stay underground. And the thing it describes, over and over, in every hour, is a river beneath the world. For decades, scholars dismissed it as symbolic. The river was the sky turned inside out. The boat was the sun. The night was death, and the dawn was rebirth. And the whole thing was a beautiful religious metaphor for the cycle of day and night. That reading is not wrong. The Egyptians absolutely believed the sun sailed through the underworld each night and was reborn at dawn. But that explanation has a problem. The Amduat is too specific. It does not describe a vague spirit world. It describes terrain. It gives the underworld rivers with names and measurements in the text. Distances in hundreds of miles, the width of waterways, the size of fields on the banks. It describes islands, mounds, caverns with doors, a region of sand where the water disappears entirely and the boat has to be dragged. These are not the details of a dream. They are the details of a place. Someone wrote them down as if they were recording features on a map. They weren't guessing, they were recording. And the recording is consistent. That's the part that's hard to explain away. The same underworld river, with the same sequence of features, appears not in one tomb, but across dozens of them, copied and recopied for more than 1,000 years. The geography barely changes. The water is always in the same place. The sandy dead zone always falls at the same hour. The sealed chamber always sits beneath the same pyramid-shaped mound. If this were pure invention, it would drift the way myths drift. Every priest adding his own monsters, moving his own rivers. It didn't drift. It was preserved carefully the way you preserve a measurement or a route or a map you cannot afford to get wrong. And before we follow that thought down into the dark, I want to ask you to do one small thing, because what comes next only makes sense if you can see the whole pattern at once. If you find buried history as unsettling as I do, subscribe and turn on the bell. This channel exists to chase exactly these threads, the ones the textbooks mention in a footnote and then quietly drop. Now, let's go back underground. To understand what the Amduat is mapping, you have to understand the Egyptian idea of the underworld itself. They called it the Duat. And here is the part that almost everyone gets wrong. The Duat was not the heavens. It was not somewhere above. The texts are explicit. The Duat is a vast region under the earth, and it is connected to something called the Nun, the deep, dark, limitless water that the Egyptians believed lay beneath all solid ground. In their model of the world, you did not have to die to reach water under the desert. You only had to dig. So, when the priests painted a river running through the underworld, they were not inventing a fantasy. They were describing the literal architecture of their world as they understood it. A thin skin of living land on top, the Nile flowing across it, and beneath all of it, hidden water. The Duat was where that hidden water lived. Now, hold that thought, because modern geology has something to say about it. Beneath the Eastern Sahara, under Egypt and Libya and Sudan and Chad, lies one of the largest reserves of fresh water on the planet. It is called the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer System. It holds an estimated 150,000 cubic kilometers of water. It is fossil water, rain that fell tens of thousands of years ago when the Sahara was green, sealed into the rock and trapped there ever since. It sits in darkness, under the sand, exactly where the Egyptians placed the waters of Nun. The Egyptians could not have known its true size, but they lived on top of its edge. They dug wells and struck water in places where the sky never gave rain. They knew the oases, Siwa, Baharia, Karga, pockets of green and standing water hundreds of kilometers out in a desert that should have been dead, fed by water rising from somewhere below. They watched springs surface in the middle of nothing. They knew, in the most practical possible way, that there was water beneath the dry world. And their sacred geography, the river that flows in darkness beneath the land, the limitless Nun under everything, sits directly on top of a geological truth we did not confirm until the 20th century. That is the first clue. The hidden water below is real. Here's where it gets strange. The Amduat describes the underground river changing as the traveler moves through it. In the early hours, it is wide and full and surrounded by fertile fields, a place the texts call worms, the waters of Osiris, abundant and alive. Then, around the 4th and 5th hours, something happens to the water. It stops. The boat enters the realm of Sokar, an ancient hawk god of the dead, and the texts describe it as a place of sand. Dry sand. The water vanishes, the river becomes a winding, zigzagging path through the desert, and the boat can no longer float. It has to be hauled overland, dragged along a twisting channel that doubles back on itself. The text is strikingly physical here. It describes the path as difficult, sandy, dark, and bent into sharp angles. The flowing river has become a dry, snaking trench buried in the desert. Mainstream Egyptology reads this as the lowest, most dangerous point of the sun's night journey, the dead zone before rebirth. And again, that reading is true on its own terms. But think about what is actually being described. A river that used to flow, that has been buried in sand, that now winds in a dry, twisting channel through the desert, going nowhere, holding no water. Because that is not just mythology. That is a textbook description of a paleo channel, a dead river preserved as a buried trench under the sand. And Egypt is full of them. In 1982, the Space Shuttle Columbia carried an experimental imaging radar over the Sahara. The instrument could do something the human eye and ordinary cameras cannot. In bone-dry sand, its signal punched through the surface to a depth of several meters and bounced back off the bedrock beneath. When the images came back, the scientists were stunned. Under the featureless dunes of the Eastern Sahara, some of the driest, deadest terrain on the planet, were entire river valleys, wide ones, branching ones, ancient watercourses, tens of kilometers across, completely invisible from the surface, completely dry, completely buried. The press called them the radar rivers. The people who actually lived near one of these dead valleys already had a name for it. They called it Ba Bella Ma, the river without water. It is almost exactly what the Egyptian texts describe in the realm of Sokar, a waterway that is no longer a waterway, a channel you cannot sail, a river reduced to a dry winding scar in the sand. The desert dwellers and the ancient priests reached for the same impossible image, because they were both staring at the same thing, a dead river that still looks like a river long after the water has gone. The land the Egyptians lived on was woven with the ghosts of rivers. They could not see them from above, but they could see what those dead rivers left behind. Strips of different soil, winding depressions, sand that swallowed water, and in the deepest, driest hour of their underworld, they wrote down exactly that. A river turned to sand, twisting through the dark, that you can no longer sail but must drag yourself across. That's the second clue. Now we get to the one that, until 2 years ago, no one could test. The fifth hour of the Amduat hides its strangest feature. At the center of the realm of Sokar, beneath a mound shaped like a pyramid, the text places a sealed, hidden chamber. Under it, a lake. The traveler cannot enter. The chamber is closed, guarded, secret. The whole structure is said to rest on the shoulders of a double-headed earth god named Acre, who represents the ground itself, the threshold between the surface world and everything beneath it. A pyramid-shaped mound, a sealed chamber, a hidden body of water directly underneath, all of it buried in the sand, at the exact point where the underground river dies. A second text, the Book of Caverns, carved most completely on the wall of a strange temple at Abydos, goes even further. It abandons the river almost entirely and instead describes the underworld as a series of 12 caverns, sealed underground spaces, one after another, each holding water, each closed off, each requiring passage from one to the next. The Egyptians were not describing a single river anymore. They were describing a system, channels, chambers, and hidden water connected underground, running beneath the visible land. For most of modern history, there was no way to check any of this. You cannot excavate a country. The Nile floodplain is buried under millions of tons of silt and centuries of farming. Whatever was down there was gone. Then, modern science found something that changed everything. In May 2024, a team led by Professor Amon Ghonem at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, published a study in the journal Communications, Earth, and Environment. They had done to the Nile Valley what the space shuttle did to the open desert. They started with radar satellite imagery that penetrates the ground surface and reveals buried channels. Then they did the unglamorous, decisive work. Electromagnetic surveys and ground-penetrating radar dragged across the fields, and 2 deep cores drilled straight down into the earth. At around 25 meters down, the drill pulled up sandy, well-sorted sediment, the unmistakable signature of a river channel. Not floodplain mud, not desert dust. River sand, sitting deep beneath ground that has looked bone dry for thousands of years. They had a buried branch of the Nile, a major one, 64 kilometers long, mapped end to end for the first time in history. They named it the Ahramat branch. Ahramat is Arabic for pyramids, because this dead, buried river runs in a chain directly past more than 30 Egyptian pyramids, including Giza. And that single fact quietly solved a mystery that had embarrassed Egyptology for a century. The pyramids are clustered along a narrow strip of inhospitable desert, far from the modern Nile, in a place that makes no logical sense to haul millions of multi-ton limestone blocks. Scholars had assumed for decades that some waterway must have run nearby, because there was no other sane way to move that much stone. But nobody could find it, locate it, or prove it existed. It was a necessary river that left no trace. Now we know why it left no trace. It was 25 meters underground. The causeways, the long stone ramps leading away from the pyramids that archaeologists never fully explained, end exactly at the buried banks of the Ahramat. The valley temples at the ends of those causeways weren't just chapels, they were harbors, docks on a river that no longer exists. The Egyptians built their entire sacred landscape along a branch of the Nile, and then they watched it die. The study points to a brutal drought that began around 4,200 years ago, combined with wind-blown sand and shifting ground that slowly choked the branch and pushed the river east. Over generations, the water on the western side retreated. The channel silted up, the sand moved in, and the great waterway that floated the stones to build the pyramids became a dry, winding trench buried beneath the desert, going nowhere, holding no water, twisting through the dark. A river that used to flow, buried in sand, now a dead channel under the ground, at the exact place the monuments cluster. Read the fifth hour of the Amduat again. The realm of sand where the river stops, the winding dry path, the pyramid-shaped mound with a sealed chamber and hidden water beneath it, resting on the back of the earth itself. Not similar, not inspired by it. The same landscape, described twice, once by satellites in 2024, and once by priests who sealed their map inside a tomb 34 centuries earlier. It was a river. It was buried, and then it disappeared. Now, this is the point where an honest investigation has to slow down, because there's a version of this story that goes too far, and I'm not going to sell it to you. Does this prove the ancient Egyptians had secret advanced technology? That they had radar, or satellite maps, or some lost super science that let them see underground? No, it doesn't, and they didn't. There is no evidence of that, and we don't need it. The truth is stranger and more human than that. The Egyptians didn't need to see underground. They lived through the river dying. The Old Kingdom, the age of the Great Pyramids, collapsed right around that 4,200-year drought, in a period of famine and chaos that their own later writings remembered as a time when the land turned to dust and the river failed. They watched a branch of the Nile shrink, choke, and vanish under the sand inside cultural memory. They buried their kings along its dead banks. They walked across the dry channel where boats once sailed. So when their priests sat down to map the underworld, a river that flows in darkness, that becomes a desert of winding dry sand, that hides sealed chambers and lost water beneath pyramid-shaped mounds, they were not receiving a vision from another world. They were encoding the memory of this one, the death of a river, transformed into the geography of the afterlife. Trauma turned into theology. That is not a lesser explanation. In some ways, it's a more astonishing one. It means the Amduat and the Book of Caverns may be among the oldest surviving environmental records on Earth. A memory of a vanished waterway, preserved for 3,000 years inside a religion, accurate enough that we could now match it line for line against radar data the Egyptians could not possibly have produced. For decades, scholars dismissed it as symbolic. They were half right. It is symbolic. But the symbol was built on top of something real, the way the Duat was built on top of real hidden water. And we threw away the real part because we only knew how to read the myth. And if that's true, it means our history is missing a chapter. Not a chapter about aliens or lost civilizations. A chapter about how much accurate, hard-won knowledge of the physical world is hiding inside texts we filed under religion and stopped reading literally. How much ancient geography we've been calling fantasy. How many other mythological rivers, mountains, and sealed chambers in how many other cultures are describing places that are still down there, under the sand, waiting for the right radar pass. And consider how nearly we missed even this one. For most of a century, the evidence was technically available and functionally ignored. The texts had been translated. The pyramids had been measured to the millimeter. The drought, at the end of the Old Kingdom, was documented in Egypt's own famine inscriptions. The radar rivers of the Sahara had been published since 1982. Every piece was sitting in the open. But the pieces lived in different rooms. The Egyptologists read the texts as theology. The geologists read the sand as climate data, and almost no one was holding both at once. The full map of the Ahramat wasn't drawn until 2024, not because the data was hidden, but because for decades the surveys were piecemeal. The funding went elsewhere, and the official explanation for the pyramid's impossible location was simply allowed to stand with a hole in the middle of it. The mystery wasn't buried by a conspiracy. It was buried by the quieter thing. Nobody connected what nobody was looking at. Because here's the part that should keep you up at night. The 2024 study mapped only one branch. The researchers were explicit that this is almost certainly not the only buried channel, and that countless temples, harbors, and structures may still lie unexcavated along its banks, and along others we haven't found yet. The Nile Valley is one of the most studied places on the planet, and we have barely begun to look beneath it. The map painted on the wall of KV-34 has more hours in it, more chambers, more sealed doors. We have only learned to read a few of them. So go back one last time to that dark chamber in the Valley of the Kings. The river is still painted on the wall, thin and straight, and running into the distance exactly where the workers left it 34 centuries ago. It has been sealed underground this whole time, in the dark, describing water in the dark. And 40 kilometers of buried riverbed still lie beneath the farmland near the pyramids, 25 meters down, unexcavated, mostly unmapped, holding whatever sank into it when the water went away. It was sealed, it was mapped, and then it disappeared. And we are only now, with satellites, learning to find it again. The Egyptians told us what was below the Nile. They wrote it on the walls of their tombs and trusted that someone, eventually, would learn to read it as more than a prayer. We're only just starting. If this rewired how you see ancient Egypt, watch the next investigation on screen now. The lost branches we still haven't found, and the temples that may be sitting under the desert right now, waiting. The map isn't finished. Keep following it with me.